It's
time for a bonus episode of the Mystical Times blog podcast. Michele Eve is taking a break this month, but she has chosen 3 spooky experiences to give your summer the chills.
The Dog in the Darkness. For this spooky encounter, we go to a terraced house that was built in the early 80s, and it comes from David, who wrote to tell me about the strange goings-on that happened in his home. David was living there with his parents when the strange activity began. There would be a terrible loud howling noise that came from the kitchen. It sounded as though it was a dog or wolf howling, but parts of the howling sounded almost human too. The howl would last for around 4 seconds, starting with a low moan or growl for a second or two, then building up to the full howl. It had a very deep tone to it, and David said he had never heard anything like it before, and it was rather hard to describe due to the dog/wolf sound along with the human element. David said he was the first to hear the howling, as after he had heard it a couple of times, his mum asked him if he'd heard any noises in the house. The conversation went something like this. "What kind of noises?" "Nothing. Forget I asked." "Wait, do you mean like a dog?" It wasn't a dog. It was after this conversation that, on occasion, David and his mum would hear the howling together. They took this in their stride and even referred to the noise as the werewolf. The howling was sporadic. Months could go past before it was heard again. There also seemed to be no reason or rhyme as to when it would occur. It was in 1987 when David's girlfriend stayed over at the house. She slept on a fold-out sofa bed in the living room, and it was that night that something strange happened. It was around 30 minutes after everyone had gone to bed when David's girlfriend ran up to his bedroom and he could see she was visibly distressed. She told him that a huge dog was just sitting there, watching her. David took what she said seriously and went downstairs, but could find no trace of a dog in the house. In the mid-90s, David was woken up in the early hours of the morning as his neighbour's daughter was shouting,
"Help! I've just seen a ghost."
David's curiosity got the better of him, so when he saw his neighbour, he asked if anybody in her house had seen anything weird. And straight away, the neighbour said she would sometimes see a strange dog in the house from time to time. David went on to tell me that the kitchen, where the noise always came from, is on the side adjacent to the neighbour's house, with their kitchen on the other side of the dividing wall, and David's bedroom, from which he heard the daughter shout, was directly above the kitchen. The howling noise was heard around 8 or 9 times from the 1980s to the mid-1990s. Also around this time, David's mum was reunited with one of her sisters, and when the sister visited the house for the first time, she exclaimed that she had once lived in the previous terrace house that had once stood where David's family home was now. She had lived in the previous house back in the 1960s, and that house had straddled the footprint of David's house and the neighbour who had seen the ghost dog. It wasn't too long when the mum's sister began talking about seeing a large dog that showed up at night when she had lived there. David added that all mentions of seeing this strange dog were never prompted and were said with sincerity. The witnesses who saw the dog would always mention the large size of the animal and say it was strange, but no further details of what it looked like. David added that nobody ever really described it in any detail other than remarking on its size and its being strange, without actually being able to explain what was strange about it. In most cases, it was seen in the dark, so it was probably just the outline or general shape they saw. Nobody ever mentioned coloration, markings, the eyes, or any other details. Going by David's account of this strange haunting, it would appear that only females saw this large dog, and it really makes me wonder as to why that happened. There were pets living in the house at the time these events occurred, but they showed no response to the howling. David still lives in the same house and happily reports he no longer hears the howling, and next door had a new family move in over a decade ago, and they have not mentioned anything strange happening in their home either. Now you see him, now you don't. The A38 is a road that runs from Derby all the way to Cornwall, and there is a 10-mile section of the road in the county of Somerset that's had many sightings of a hitchhiker who would always be described as a middle-aged man wearing a long light-coloured overcoat whilst holding a torch downwards. He would sometimes appear in the middle of the road so that when a lone driver would see him, they would swerve so not to hit him, but the man was nowhere to be seen when the driver stopped their car and checked their mirrors. On one occasion, it was a motorcyclist who, upon seeing the figure in the road, swerved too abruptly, fell off and broke a limb. These incidents were reported to a local Somerset newspaper in the early 1970s, and a man, a Mr. Unsworth, contacted the newspaper to tell of his strange encounters with this phantom hitchhiker that had occurred in the 1950s. Mr. Unsworth had been a lorry driver, and the A38 was a road he regularly drove on in the early hours of the morning. He was rather embarrassed to tell of his experiences, but felt he needed to. It was around 3 a.m. and Mr. Unsworth was driving back to his depot on the A38. The weather that morning was wet and damp when Mr. Unsworth saw a man trying to flag down a lift. This man looked soaked to the bone as his longish greyish hair was dripping with water. He was wearing a light-coloured overcoat and carrying a torch, so Mr. Unsworth saw him and stopped his lorry to offer this man a lift. The hitchhiker spoke with a well-educated accent and asked Mr. Unsworth to drop him off by a bridge, which was around 4 miles away. As they travelled along, the hitchhiker began talking about accidents that had happened at this bridge. He spoke about these gruesome accidents in a gleeful tone, and Mr. Unsworth was glad when the hitchhiker finally got out the lorry. It was several days later when Mr. Unsworth was travelling on the A38 at 3 a.m. on a wet and cold morning. As he approached a stretch of road where he had previously picked up the hitchhiker, he was shocked to see the man again, trying to flag down a lift. For whatever reason, Mr. Unsworth gave this man a lift to the same bridge as the first time. Yet again, this man held the same strange conversation about accidents at the bridge and spoke about it in the same gleeful tone. This was to happen a third time, and Mr. Unsworth felt the man was mentally disturbed due to hitchhiking in such foul weather in the early hours of the morning, and to talk about such harrowing accidents. He was relieved not to see the figure again in the following months. That was until an early, murky and rainy morning in November. Mr. Unsworth gave him yet another lift. Mr. Unsworth felt this was becoming rather odd, but this time the hitchhiker asked if Mr. Unsworth could wait at the bridge for him, as he had a few things he needed to collect and wanted to travel a few miles further after these items had been collected. So Mr. Unsworth let out the hitchhiker and waited. He waited a good while, but the hitchhiker hadn't returned, so Mr. Unsworth decided to leave. He had gone 3 miles up the A38 when, all of a sudden, he saw the man he had dropped off at the bridge. There was no mistaking his overcoat, hair and torch. Mr. Unsworth thought it would have been impossible for the man to cover the 3-mile distance on foot alone, and he had not seen any other cars on the road since dropping the hitchhiker off. Mr. Unsworth gave this man a wide berth, and as he did so, the man jumped right in front of the lorry, so the lorry had to swerve, and Mr. Unsworth managed to keep his lorry under control. He stopped the lorry and got out. What he saw was the figure of the hitchhiker on the road, shaking his fists and swearing out loud. Mr. Unsworth quickly got back in his lorry, feeling the need for some sort of normality, as this situation didn't make any sense. Fortunately, Mr. Unsworth was never to see this hitchhiker again. The A38 has had many fatal accidents over the years, so just who is this phantom hitchhiker? Just be extra careful if you ever find yourself driving down a lonely stretch of the A38 in Somerset in the dark. If you go down to the woods today. This is the go-to post on Mumsnet when spooky experiences are discussed. So here's the post. Warning, it's very long, sorry, and very freaky, and if anyone can come up with a rational explanation, I'd be extremely grateful, because I'm a generally pretty rational, non-woo, where's the evidence person. But I've never been able to explain this, and it still makes my heart beat faster, and the hair stand up on my arms when I think about it years later. I was pet sitting for my friend several years ago. She had moved into a sort of small holding right on the edge of a village in the southwest of England, with a huge garden that backed onto trees. At the time she had chickens, ducks, a couple of Shetlands, cats and 4 black retrievers, 3 of which were fully grown and 1 was a half-grown puppy. Originally, my husband had been going to come with me as a little holiday, but the date she ended up having to go away for work clashed with a couple of his medical appointments, so he stayed at home with our dog, and I went to pet sit alone. It was halfway through my stay, with just a couple more nights to go. Late one evening, already dark, when I heard a massive commotion from the chicken shed, banging and thumping. I assumed a fox or something had got in, so went out to check. As I was halfway across the garden, the noise stopped instantly, as if it had been shut off. By the time I got to the shed, all was calm and the chickens were all settled, mostly asleep. No sign of any intruder or disturbance at all. Nothing to explain the noise or any indications that the chickens had made a noise. Bit freaky, but I didn't know much about the ways of chickens, so I locked up again and left them to it. As I went back into the house, a small black shape ran past me out of the back door, and I realised the puppy must have got out. It streaked across the garden and off towards the woods. Cue much cursing, then calling her name in vain. More cursing when she didn't come back. I grabbed a torch, put 1 of the other dogs on the lead, partly for protection, partly because I thought the pup was more likely to come back if I had one of her canine companions with me, and partly because I didn't fancy my chances of finding my way back to the house on my own, even though there were a couple of vague paths that I had followed when walking the dogs throughout the week. Off we trudged into the woods along one of these paths, me calling Pup's name at intervals and trying not to imagine murderers and rapists behind every tree trunk. We got to a point where it felt like the trees were starting to thin out, and I remember thinking that I didn't remember a clearing on this path, and we must have gone wrong somewhere when the dog with me slowed right down and started to resist going forward. I tried to jolly her along, while my stomach suddenly dropped like a stone, and she started growling, a really low, serious, rumbling growl. By this time, I was practically crapping myself. I tried shining the torch ahead, but the beam just sort of bounced back off the darkness, if that makes sense. I got the sense of something, or some things, moving, but just sinuous, deeper black shapes against the blackness and always on the periphery of vision. The hairs on my arms are standing up again, and just remembering how completely and utterly terrified I was. I've honestly never known a feeling like it. At this point, the dog sat right down, still growling, hackles up, and refused to budge. I muttered something like, "Jesus, you've got to be kidding me!" And this ugly, gurgling, inhumane voice hissed right up close, as if someone was right next to me.
"Don't say that name."
At the same time, there was a horrible snickering sort of laugh. I can't express how utterly petrified I was. I can't remember having any coherent thoughts apart from the word evil. That's the only clear thing I remember. Me and the dog were frozen to the spot with pure fear. Then a different voice, really commanding, said,
"Go back."
That sounded more in my head, but echoey, where the others had sounded out in the air. Wherever it came from, it did the trick. Me and the dog turned and belted back through the woods. She basically towed me. I just clung onto her lead, stumbling to keep up and sobbing with fear. I lost the torch somewhere in that wild run, but there was no way I was stopping to find it. How I didn't run blindly into a tree, I'll never know. She guided me, I guess. I can remember thinking desperately that I mustn't let go of her lead, or they would get me. When we got back to the garden, she suddenly stopped. I did fall over her this time onto my hands and knees, and she turned round, started snarling, proper teeth-bared, rabid-looking snarls, back at the trees and the darkness. I thought I heard the snickering again, but the blood was pounding in my ears so hard I couldn't be sure. I scrambled up and ran to the back door, and she followed me, but barking and snarling all the way, as if holding something at bay. Oh, and the chicken shed was banging and the thumping again. I got the back door open. Me and the dog belted in. I slammed every bolt behind us. The other dogs left behind were staring at the door and growling too with their hackles up. And when I saw all three of them, puppy included, acting like that, I started to cry properly, because I honestly thought I was trapped in some horror film nightmare and I was going to die. I don't know, I still don't know, what the black shape that ran past me out of the house and triggered all of this, because the puppy was right there in the kitchen. I made sure every door and window was locked and bolted. I turned on every light in the house. I wandered round mumbling all sorts of weird, half-religious, half-spiritual shit to ward off evil spirits. Gradually, the dog settled down and stopped growling, and eventually stopped glancing at the door. Funnily enough, I didn't sleep for 1 second that night, and I rang my husband and begged him to come over the last couple of days. I know I didn't dream it, because I was covered in scratches from running through the woods and had grazed hands where I fell over the dog in the garden. Nothing like that has happened before or since, and I hope it never, ever does. It was the most horrible, terrifying experience of my life.
We hope you enjoyed this Summer Chills bonus episode. Michele Eve will be back for a brand new episode of the Mystical Times blog podcast on September 27th. That episode is called The Somerset Ghost. Till next time.